After the pilots lost consciousness mid-flight, a 15-year-old boy took control of the plane, and what he did left everyone in tears. The sun had just begun to rise over the horizon when 15-year-old Mike Jackson walked through the automatic doors of the airport. His eyes sparkled with excitement, and a small backpack, decorated with airplane stickers and holding his trusted aviation manual, hung over his shoulder. Beside him, his mother Sarah pushed a red suitcase. Though she looked tired, her proud smile shone brightly. This trip was not just a vacation. It was the result of months of hard work, long hours, and careful saving. As they approached the boarding gate, Mike could barely contain his excitement. He eagerly pointed at the planes on the tarmac, identifying the different models and airlines with impressive accuracy. "Look, Mom, that's a Boeing, and over there, an Airbus A815, he exclaimed. Sarah, who knew little about airplanes, simply smiled, marveling at her son's passion. Though Sarah didn't know much about aviation, her son's excitement was contagious. "You really know everything about planes, Lee. You're definitely going to be a pilot someday, huh?" she said with a smile. Soon, the moment Mike had been waiting for arrived. Boarding the plane. Taking a deep breath, he stepped into the narrow aisle, his eyes soaking in every detail. The seat upholstery, the overhead bins, the ceiling lights. He even tried to catch a glimpse of the cockpit as they walked by. Once they settled into their seats, Mike pressed his face against the window, mesmerized by the activity on the runway and the mechanics working on the aircraft. "Mom, did you know that a Boeing A325 like this one can reach speeds of up to 500 miles per hour?" he asked eagerly. "That's amazing, sweetheart," Sarah replied, adjusting her seatbelt with a proud smile. "Who knows? Maybe you'll be flying one of these someday," Sarah said with a smile. As the plane taxied down the runway, Mike felt a surge of adrenaline. The growing roar of the engines, the vibrations beneath his feet, and finally, the powerful thrust of takeoff. It all sent a thrilling rush through him. He was pushed back into his seat as the plane soared into the sky, and soon, the world below disappeared into a sea of clouds. Once the flight stabilized, a flight attendant began walking down the aisle. Mike, typically shy, hesitated for a moment, but then gathered the courage to speak. "Excuse me, what's our altitude right now?" he asked. The flight attendant, pleasantly surprised, smiled. "We're at 30,000 feet. Are you interested in aviation?" Mike nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, I spend hours on a flight simulator. I even know how autopilot works and how to read basic instruments." Sarah chuckled softly, proud of her son's confidence. The flight attendant, visibly impressed, said, "You sound like a real expert. Keep it up and maybe one day we'll be working together." The flight attendant walked away, but not before handing Mike a small sticker with the airline's logo. He carefully tucked it into his backpack like a prized trophy. The flight continued smoothly, and Mike savored every moment. He appreciated everything, from the onboard meal to the smallest details like the safety instructions, the illuminated signs, and the crew's announcements. This wasn't just a trip. It was a dream taking flight. As the plane soared over the Caribbean Sea, a sudden jolt interrupted the tranquility. A slight shake, like a small bump in the air. Mike immediately noticed the shift in the cabin's atmosphere. Conversations quieted, and passengers exchanged uneasy glances. Moments later, the calm voice of the captain came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some mild turbulence. Please keep your seatbelts fastened. Everything is under control." Mike tightened his seatbelt, trying to appear calm, but his eyes remained glued to the plane's wing, which swayed slightly with each bump. Mike understood that turbulence was normal, but something about this felt different. He couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. Sensing her son's unease, Sarah placed a gentle hand on his. "It's okay, Mike. The pilot knows what he's doing." Mike nodded, but his eyes remained fixed on the window. The plane jolted again, harder this time, and the seatbelt sign glowed brightly above. A flight attendant walked down the aisle, checking that everyone was buckled in, her calm demeanor reassuring. But as the shaking intensified, even Mike, despite his knowledge of aviation, felt a knot forming in his stomach. He understood more than most about what turbulence could mean, and this wasn't normal. Suddenly, a powerful jolt rocked the plane, followed by a metallic clanging sound reverberating through the fuselage. The murmurs of concern among passengers turned into gasps of fear. Mike glanced at Sarah. She tried to offer a reassuring smile, but he could see the worry in her eyes. Something was wrong. Very, very wrong. As the plane subtly began to lose altitude, Mike closed his eyes and took a deep breath, steadying himself. He didn't know it yet, but he was about to face the greatest challenge of his life. The plane shook violently now, like a leaf caught in a storm. The jolts escalated into sudden drops, drawing screams and panicked whispers from the passengers. Mike gripped the armrests tightly, his knuckles turning white, while Sarah, sitting beside him, held his hand firmly, trying to project a calmness she didn't truly feel. The captain's voice echoed through the speakers once more, but this time, there was a noticeable tension in his tone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are encountering severe turbulence. Please keep your seatbelts fastened and remain seated." Mike frowned. Something wasn't right. Despite the captain's announcement, the eerie silence from the cockpit felt out of place. From his aviation studies, he knew that in emergencies, pilots typically maintained frequent communication with the crew or passengers. But now, after the brief announcement, there was only silence. A chilling void that set his nerves on edge. He turned to Sarah, hesitating. "Mom, something is wrong. They should be talking more, explaining what is happening." Sarah looked at him, surprised by the sharpness of his observation. Before she could respond, the plane suddenly lurched sharply to one side, causing passengers to scream in terror. A moment later, the oxygen masks dropped from above, dangling like eerie specters, swaying in front of each passenger. The sight turned the cabin into a scene of silent dread, punctuated only by gasps and cries. Mike and Sarah quickly secured their oxygen masks, but Mike's growing unease gnawed at him. He was convinced something far more serious was unfolding. In the aisle, the flight attendant struggled to maintain order, moving from row to row with calming words. But her nervous eyes betrayed the reassurance she tried to offer. Despite the lump in his throat and his usual shyness, Mike summoned his courage and called out as she passed by. "Ma'am, please, what's happening in the cockpit? I think something's wrong." The flight attendant stopped, frowning. "Everything is under control, sir," she began. But Mike interrupted, his voice steady and insistent. "It's not. If it were, the pilot would be talking to us more. I read about this in the safety manual. Something is wrong. I'm sure of it." The flight attendant hesitated, glancing toward the cockpit. Her composure wavered, the distress in her eyes now evident. Still, she attempted to maintain her professionalism. "We can't open the cabin door without authorization," she said. Mike met her gaze, his expression serious and unwavering. "If they're unconscious, no one is flying the plane. We need to check. Please, let me help." Sarah, alarmed by her son's determination, reached for his arm. "Mike, this isn't your responsibility." But Mike didn't waver. "Mom, if we don't do something, it could be too late." Mike was just a kid when the conversation was abruptly interrupted by a violent jolt, causing the plane to drop suddenly. Cups and trays flew across the floor, and some passengers screamed in panic. The cockpit's shrill alarms blared, convincing the flight attendant to act. She quickly hurried to the cockpit door, entered the emergency code on the panel, and the door slowly opened, revealing a scene that left Mike frozen in place. Both pilots were slumped over, unconscious, their oxygen masks askew. Flashing lights and blaring alarms warned of imminent danger as the aircraft tilted dangerously downward. The flight attendant, covering her mouth in horror, whispered, "Oh my God, they're not okay." Mike stepped forward, despite Sarah's attempts to stop him. "I knew it," he said. "The alarms, the autopilot isn't on. We're losing altitude fast." The flight attendant looked between Mike and the unconscious pilots, paralyzed by uncertainty. She pressed the emergency button to alert ground control, but interference from the storm caused a delay in the response. With each passing second, the plane drew closer to danger. "We don't have time to wait for help," Mike insisted. "I know how to operate the basic controls. Please let me try to stabilize the plane." The flight attendant hesitated, eyeing the slender boy with a mixture of doubt and desperation. "Do you really know what you're doing?" she asked. Mike took a deep breath, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "I'm not a pilot, but I can read the instruments and adjust the autopilot. It's our only chance until air traffic control can help us." She nodded slowly, still in shock from the situation. "Okay, let's try, but I'll stay with you the whole time." Sarah, though terrified, realized her son was right. Tears welled in her eyes as she watched him approach the cockpit, seeing him transform from the shy boy she knew into someone ready to face a monumental challenge. Mike entered the cockpit, his hands shaking. The control panel was lit with flashing red and yellow warnings, and the deafening sound of alarms filled the air. He sat in the co-pilot's seat, swallowed hard, and began scanning the instruments. The plane was in a steep descent. The systems were overloaded, but with the flight attendant's assistance, Mike activated the radio and managed to make initial contact with air traffic control. Calm, deep voice broke through the static. "This is Miami Air Traffic Control. Identify yourself and explain your situation." Mike gripped the microphone, his hands sweaty, and responded, his voice trembling. "I'm Mike Jackson, a passenger. Both pilots are unconscious. I'm in the cockpit and the plane is descending rapidly. I need help." There was a brief pause before the voice replied, "Understood, Mike. We're here to help. Stay calm and follow our instructions. You can do this." Mike took a deep breath, knowing there was no other option. He was in control now. The cockpit was a scene of complete chaos. The control panel was filled with flashing warning lights, each one demanding immediate attention. Alarms blared non-stop, like a countdown to disaster. The plane's constant shaking made even the smallest movement feel like a struggle. Mike adjusted himself in the co-pilot's seat, feeling the weight of an unimaginable responsibility. He knew that despite his hours of simulator training and studying manuals, this situation was entirely different. Lives were depending on him. The calm, precise voice of the Miami air traffic controller came through the radio again. "Mike, we're here to help. First, I need to know, is the autopilot engaged?" the controller asked. Mike scanned the panel, quickly locating the autopilot indicators. The blinking light confirmed his worst fear. The system had been disengaged. "It's not on. The plane is descending manually and we're losing altitude fast," he replied, trying to keep panic out of his voice. "Understood. The first step is to stabilize the descent. Look at the control yoke in front of you. Gently pull it back while keeping your eyes on the artificial horizon. Don't move it too quickly, or the plane could stall," the controller instructed. Mike nodded to himself, gripping the yoke with trembling hands. He took a deep breath and pulled it back slightly, feeling the resistance of the massive aircraft. The plane responded, but the movement caused an even stronger jolt, making Mike's heart race. "It's really heavy," he exclaimed. "That's normal. Keep steady, Mike. You're doing great," the controller reassured him. Gradually, the plane began to level out. The artificial horizon adjusted on the panel, indicating that the aircraft was pulling out of its dangerous descent. Mike felt a small sense of relief, but he knew this was just the beginning. Behind him, the flight attendant clung to the back of a seat for support as the plane continued to tremble. She picked up the intercom and calmly addressed the passengers, her voice composed despite the chaos surrounding her. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain in your seats and follow all safety instructions. The situation is under control and we are working to stabilize the flight," the flight attendant announced. Despite the tension in the cabin, her words offered a small sense of comfort. Mike briefly glanced over his shoulder and met his mother's gaze. She gave him a shaky smile, but her tear-filled eyes revealed her fear. Mike turned back to the control panel, refocusing on the task ahead. The controller's voice came through the radio once more. "Now that we've stabilized, we need to adjust your altitude and speed. Mike, check the airspeed indicator. Is your speed within the safe range?" Mike found the airspeed indicator, and his stomach sank when he saw the needle dangerously close to the red zone. "It's too high. How do I reduce it?" he asked. "Move the throttle levers to your right and pull them back slowly to reduce engine power. Make smooth, gradual adjustments," the controller instructed. Mike reached for the throttles, carefully pulling them back. The vibration of the plane lessened slightly as the speed began to drop. A brief smile flickered across his face as he saw progress. But then a new alarm sounded, and a flashing red light on the panel signaled a pressurization problem. "Mike, we're getting a pressurization alert. Can you confirm if the automatic pressurization system is active?" the controller asked. Mike quickly searched for the switch and found it was off. He activated it, but the controller's voice came through again. "Good, but we need to make sure the oxygen masks are working. Ask the flight attendant to check on the passengers." The flight attendant nodded and rushed off, leaving Mike to continue adjusting the plane. Sweat dripped down his face as the controller's calm voice remained in his ear. "Mike, you're doing an excellent job. Now let's engage the autopilot to keep the plane stable while we prepare for the approach." Following the detailed instructions, Mike managed to re-engage the autopilot, the first time since the crisis began. The plane flew steadily, and for the first time, Mike had a few seconds to breathe. He looked around the cockpit, fully taking in the gravity of the situation. He picked up the radio again, his voice shaking. "Miami Control, what's next?" "Mike, we need to guide the plane onto an approach path. We're coordinating with Miami International Airport to give you priority landing clearance. I'll guide you step by step, but you need to stay calm. Are you ready?" Mike gripped the radio tightly, his voice filled with determination. "Yes, I'm ready." The controller continued. "Adjust the course. Look at the navigation panel and use the heading knob to set the plane to a heading of 270. That will take you toward—" Mike turned the knob, watching as the plane adjusted to the new heading. The clouds below began to break apart, revealing the ocean far beneath them, a chilling reminder of how far they were from safety. Meanwhile, the flight attendant returned to the cockpit, reporting that all passengers were safe and had their oxygen masks on. Mike glanced at her quickly, aware that she was relying on him. Despite the enormous responsibility, he could not let anyone down. With the plane stabilized and on course, Mike pressed the radio button again. "We're ready for the next step. What do I do now?" The controller's calm voice came through the radio. "Now comes the most critical part, Mike. The landing. And you can do it. We're with you." Mike nodded, even though no one could see him. He knew the hardest part was still ahead, but for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he could save everyone on board. Mike focused intently on the panel in front of him, his eyes sharp and his heart racing. The plane, stable for now, felt like a sleeping giant, ready to rebel at any moment. Lights flashed across the cockpit, each one signaling something urgent. He knew there was no time to relax. Gripping the radio firmly, he listened closely to the steady, reassuring instructions from the Miami air traffic controller. "Mike, we need to do a quick checklist before initiating the approach. Tell me, are the flaps set for the initial descent?" Mike searched for the flap controls and checked their position. They were still retracted, so he began adjusting them. As he did, a new red light flashed on the panel, followed by a loud alarm. Mike felt a wave of anxiety. He turned to the flight attendant behind him, trying to remain calm. "New alarm, Miami Control. Something's wrong. Looks like a hydraulic system failure." The response came swiftly, laced with concern. "Mike, the hydraulic system controls several critical aircraft functions, including the flaps and landing gear. Check the secondary panel to confirm if the primary system is still working." Mike quickly scanned the secondary panel, his breath short but steady. He finally located the hydraulic system indicator. The primary system is losing pressure. It's nearly inoperative. The controller's voice grew more urgent. Understood. We'll need to switch to the manual backup system. It's not ideal, but it should give us enough control to proceed. I'll walk you through it. Are you ready? Mike nodded quickly. Yes. Mike adjusted the controls as instructed. He knew this gave them some time, but the situation was still critical. Without the primary hydraulic system, there was a risk the landing gear might fail to deploy. He recalled from the simulators how disastrous such failures could be. What about the landing gear? It's hydraulic too, isn't it? He asked, his voice shaky. There was a brief pause before the controller responded. Yes, Mike, it's possible the landing gear won't deploy automatically. If that happens, we'll use the manual override. For now, focus on what's in front of you. We'll take it step by step. Sensing the boy's anxiety, the flight attendant placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. You're doing an incredible job. Everyone is counting on you, but don't worry. You've got this. Mike nodded, though doubts gripped his mind. He was just 15 years old, and even with his theoretical knowledge, he feared he might not be able to save the plane. What if I mess up? What if they all die because of me? As if sensing his inner turmoil, the controller's voice came back, calm and reassuring. Mike, listen to me. I know this is tough, but everything you've done so far has kept this plane in the air. You can do this. Just follow my instructions. One step at a time. Mike took a deep breath. The plane seemed to respond better after the hydraulic adjustments, but the looming issue of the landing gear still hung over him like a dark cloud. He forced himself to concentrate on what he could control. Course adjustment complete. We're aligned for the initial approach, he reported after checking the instruments. The controller's calm voice came back. Excellent work, Mike. Now we'll begin slowing down. Can you deploy the spoiler to assist? Mike located the spoiler controls and activated them, but another alert appeared on the panel. He read it aloud. Partial spoiler failure. It's only working on one side. The controller replied quickly. That's fine. It will cause some instability, but we can manage. Gently adjust the yoke to maintain balance. Mike followed the instructions, feeling the plane shudder more sharply. He gripped the yoke tightly, carefully controlling the pitch and roll until the aircraft steadied. At that moment, the flight attendant, holding a portable radio, received a report from the technical compartment. She turned to Mike. Her face pale, the flight attendant turned to Mike. Mike, they're telling me the landing gear isn't responding to the automatic command. It won't deploy. This was the moment Mike had dreaded. Without the landing gear, landing safely would be nearly impossible. He grabbed the radio with trembling hands and relayed the situation to Miami Control. After a brief pause, the controller's voice came through. Mike, we'll need to use the manual emergency system to lower the landing gear. The control is to your left, below the panel. You'll have to crank the lever multiple times to force it down. It's a physical effort, but it will work. Can you do it? Mike located the lever and began turning it with all his strength. The gears groaned under the pressure, and sweat poured down his face as he repeated the motion. His arms began to ache, but he couldn't stop. The flight attendant joined him, gripping the lever alongside him. After what felt like an eternity, a metallic click echoed through the cabin. A green light flashed on the panel. The landing gear was down. Mike released the lever, gasping for breath. Landing gear deployed. Green light confirmed. The response came, filled with relief. Outstanding work, Mike. Now let's focus on the landing. You've come this far. You're almost there. Mike closed his eyes for a brief moment, took a deep breath, and steeled himself. He knew the hardest challenge was still ahead, bringing this massive aircraft safely to the ground. The tension in the cockpit was palpable. Mike sat in the co-pilot's seat, his hands gripping the yoke tightly, his eyes fixed on the instrument panel. Outside, the once blue sky had been replaced by thick, dense clouds, rendering visibility nearly zero. The radio buzzed with the calm but urgent voice of the Miami air traffic controller. Mike, you're approximately 6 minutes from the runway. The weather isn't favorable, but the airport's approach systems will guide you to align the plane. We'll do this together." Mike nodded, adjusting the controls as he had learned in simulators. His palms were sweaty, but he couldn't afford to lose grip. He knew that every pair of eyes on the plane, though unseen, was figuratively fixed on him. The flight attendant returned to the cockpit, her expression serious yet determined. "Mike, the passengers are silent. Many are praying. They believe in you." Mike swallowed hard. "They believe in me," he thought, feeling the immense weight of responsibility. He turned back to the radio. "I can't see the runway. The navigation system is guiding me, but the wind is strong and the plane is shaking a lot." "Understood," came the controller's calm reply. "Mike, we're fine-tuning the approach signals to ensure you can align with the runway. Remember, trust your instruments. Don't try to look outside. Focus on the panels and follow our commands." The plane suddenly jolted violently as a gust of wind struck. Mike tightened his grip on the yoke, fighting to maintain control. The artificial horizon wavered, and he poured all his focus into stabilizing the aircraft. "The wind is pulling us left. What do I do?" he asked, his breath labored. "Correct gently with the yoke. Use the rudder pedals to maintain balance. Don't overcompensate. Do it slowly." Mike followed the instructions, carefully adjusting the plane's course. He knew the runway was ahead, even though it remained hidden in the thick cloud. The radio buzzed on with precise guidance. "Mike, you're almost there. The runway will appear in just a few seconds. Reduce your speed to 160 knots. Set the flaps to 30 degrees for additional lift." He did as instructed, pulling back the throttle and adjusting the flaps. A new warning light flashed on the panel, but Mike ignored it, focusing solely on the essential tasks. Suddenly, the clouds began to part, revealing the glowing outline of the runway lights. Mike's heart raced. The runway was closer than he expected. "Control, I see the runway," he announced, his voice a mix of relief and panic. "Excellent, Mike. Now focus on alignment. Keep the nose of the plane slightly elevated. You need to decelerate progressively as you near the ground. Remember, touch down with the main landing gear first." The plane hurtled toward the runway, the lights shimmering like a beacon, but the crosswind made the approach dangerous. Mike gripped the yoke with all his strength, constantly correcting the course as the controller guided him. "Mike, you're well aligned now. Reduce your speed to 120 knots and prepare for touchdown." The next few seconds felt like an eternity. Mike felt the plane descending, and every fiber of his being urged him to stay calm. He adjusted the yoke, keeping the nose elevated as instructed. Then it happened. The main landing gear struck the runway with a jarring thud, sending a violent shudder through the plane. For a moment, Mike thought he'd made a mistake, but the radio reassured him almost instantly. "Fantastic, Mike. Now decelerate. Use the thrust reversers to slow the plane. You're doing great." Mike pulled the thrust levers, activating the reversers. The deafening roar of the engine slowing filled the cabin. The aircraft raced down the runway, steadily losing speed. Finally, the plane came to a halt at the end of the runway. For a moment, there was absolute silence. Then cheers and applause erupted from the passenger cabin. Tears of relief streamed down the faces of both crew and passengers alike. Mike released the yoke, panting, his hands trembling uncontrollably. The flight attendant placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did it, Mike. You saved everyone." The radio came to life again, the controller's voice filled with admiration. "Mike, the entire airport is on its feet. You're a hero." Mike didn't respond immediately. He looked out at the runway ahead, now still and peaceful, his mind still processing what had just happened. He was just a 15-year-old boy, but at that moment, he had achieved the impossible. The plane was stationary on the runway, surrounded by emergency vehicles with flashing lights. The doors had opened, and a line of firefighters and paramedics were assisting passengers down the stairs. Outside, the sound of applause from airport staff and rescue teams filled the air. Despite the physical and emotional exhaustion, Mike remained seated in the cockpit, staring at the plane's controls as if he still needed to guide it. The flight attendant knelt beside him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Mike, it's over. Everything's okay now. You were incredible." Mike looked at her, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. Finally, he released the yoke, realizing his fingers were numb from gripping it so tightly. I didn't want anything bad to happen to my mom or to anyone." Sarah was among the first passengers to disembark. When she saw Mike, she ran to embrace him as he stepped out of the cockpit. Wrapping her arms around him, she sobbed with relief. "My son, my hero. I was so scared, but I knew you could do it. You're so brave." Mike didn't know how to respond. He hugged his mother back, but inside, it still felt like he was trapped in a strange dream or surreal nightmare. What he had done seemed unimaginable. As mother and son descended the stairs, the applause grew louder. Firefighters, paramedics, pilots, and even passengers from other flights had gathered to honor the boy who had saved the plane. Mike immediately blushed. He had never liked being the center of attention. All he wanted now was to disappear into the background, but that seemed impossible. The crowd pressed in, and reporters pushed forward, their microphones and cameras aimed at him. Questions poured in. How did you manage to fly the plane? What went through your mind during the landing? Do you dream of becoming a pilot? Mike turned to Sarah, overwhelmed and confused. Sensing her son's discomfort, she stepped in. "Please, he's just a child. Today, all we want is to rest and be thankful we're alive." The crowd respected her words, parting to make way for them. Mike spotted the air traffic controller who had guided him through the ordeal, now standing with the paramedics. The man, a gray-haired veteran, greeted him with a warm smile. "You did an incredible job, kid. I'm certain even some experienced pilots wouldn't have handled it as well as you did." Mike shook his head modestly. "I just did what I had to do. I'm not a real pilot. I just know a bit about planes because I like studying them." The controller patted him on the shoulder. "That's more than enough, Mike. You saved many lives today. Never doubt that." In the days that followed, the story spread worldwide. Newspapers, TV channels, and social media were flooded with headlines about the kid pilot. Mike became an overnight sensation. But Mike avoided the spotlight. When reporters tried to contact him, he politely declined, choosing instead to spend time with his mother and return to his simple routine. The airline, immensely grateful, offered lifetime free flights for both Mike and Sarah. During a special ceremony in his honor, they presented him with a miniature replica of the plane he had landed, engraved with a heartfelt dedication. "To our young hero who proved that the impossible can be achieved." Mike accepted the gift with a shy smile. But what mattered most to him wasn't the recognition. It was the realization that, despite how terrifying the experience had been, it had solidified what he had always known deep down. He wanted to be a pilot. As the days passed, he doubled down on his studies. He spent hours on simulators, devoured aviation manuals, and eagerly asked questions to the pilots who came to meet the prodigy. What had once been a passion had transformed into a calling. One night, as he gazed at the starry sky through his bedroom window, Mike spoke softly, almost to himself. "One day, I'll fly a real plane. And this time, it won't be an emergency. It'll be my job, my life." Sarah, standing in the doorway, overheard her son's words. She smiled and sat beside him. "You've already proven you're capable, Mike. What happened was just the beginning." He smiled back, feeling more confident than ever. Deep down, he knew the true landing was yet to come, the day he would take off as a pilot and fulfill the dream that had saved so many lives. I hope you enjoyed the story. If you did, subscribe to the channel so you do not miss more stories.